What has gripped us more as a nation in this past year than the stories of what's happening at the border? What is happening when families are being separated, children are being separated from their parents, when people are being denied their rights to asylum? What is happening at the border in so many ways, it seems to be a violation of our national heritage beyond just our laws. But it's complex as much as it is tragic. And so this next session is designed to help us understand from some expert opinion and perspective and experience just what is taking place at the border. So Sophia Lee, a senior reporter at World Magazine, who has reported extensively on the issues at the border, is going to lead us in a conversation with the panel. Sophia, please come up and introduce us to your panel.
Good evening. When I first started reporting on the border, that was when thousands of people were coming up through the migrant caravans towards the southern border. And really, the reason why I started reporting on it was because I was getting conflicting information about what's going on. There are stories about how they're invading the border, storming our country, demanding to get in. And then there are also stories about how these are poor, vulnerable people who are refugees. And so I just really got very confused, and I just wanted to see what the heck is going on. Like, I need to see with my own eyes, hear with my own ears what is going on. So I went down to the border to Tijuana and just started talking to people, visiting shelters, talking to the pastors, talking to the migrants and asylum seekers. And honestly, I thought that I was gonna go down maybe a couple times and then write one feature story about it, and then that's it. But I ended up going there again and again and again because there is just so much going on. And even me, this is my full-time job reporting on this, and I can barely keep up with what's going on. It is, like, you already know what's happening at the border, what's happening with the immigration crisis. It's just very complex, very messy. It is overwhelming. It is very revealing, and it is momentous because it impacts so many people's lives. So what I found is that this is not just a domestic issue. This is a global issue. This is not just a political issue or a social issue, but this is a biblical issue. So that's why I'm really excited to have our 4 panelists tonight. We have Matthew Soerens from World Relief. He is going to tell us about the legal side of things, plus what's happening with the refugee resettlement program. And then we have Sami DiPasquale, who is the executive director of Ciudad Nueva in El Paso. And he's going to be able to talk about what churches are doing at the border. And then we have Juvenal Gonzalez, who is the church planting catalyst missionary for the San Diego Southern Baptist Association. And he can tell us what's happening on the Mexican side. And we have Tawnya Brown, Vice President of National Refugee and Immigrant Family Services with Bethany Christian Services. And she can share with us how Bethany has been caring for the unaccompanied minor children. So welcome everyone. So all of you have been working with issues related to immigration on border for quite a few years. Sami, I think you've been working for 13 years. Matthew, 12 years. Tawnya, 8 years. And Juvenal for 18 years? 14 years, okay. Yeah, so obviously, we've had people migrating across the border for many, many years. But right now, what we're hearing is that this is a crisis. So can you tell me what you think, how you see this as a crisis or not, and what are some of the most significant changes that has happened that constitutes what's happening right now as a crisis?
I can start, and I'll start by apologizing. If you see your program, I'm not supposed to be on this panel. My World Relief colleague, Jose Serrano, was supposed to be here, but he is one of our legal representatives at World Relief, and he has a Venezuelan asylum seeker client in Tijuana who got his court date scheduled. And he tried to explain to the judge this was not a convenient week for his court date to be scheduled, and the judge wasn't really taking that. So Jose called me last week and said, I'm really sorry, but my first obligation has to be to this client. But I mentioned that almost as an introduction to the crisis at the border. One of the big changes at the U.S.-Mexican border, I mean, it's not new that there are people showing up there and there are people being apprehended crossing the border unlawfully. In fact, the numbers, though they were way up last year compared to the year before or the last several years, they're actually lower than the number that was coming in the early 2000s or even in the 90s at different points. But what's distinct is a much higher percentage of people now are not single adults, and they're not primarily coming from Mexico. They're largely families, and mostly coming from mostly, not entirely, but from Central America, especially El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And a very large percentage of them are seeking asylum, which means under U.S. law they are professing to have a credible fear of persecution because of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. And to be really clear, I don't think they all qualify. I think some of them do qualify, and that's where we get into trouble as a country when our policies try to put these blunt instruments that wants to see literally tens of thousands of people and presume they all have the same story. But I'll mention Jose's case with the permission of this young man. His name is Juvenal. He's actually from Venezuela. Most of you are aware that Venezuela is in a very troubling situation right now. Juvenal was a student activist in Venezuela. He's an architecture student in college. His activism got him in some trouble. Some thugs from the Maduro regime basically beat him up badly enough that he was hospitalized. And after that happened, he fled. He went first, I think, to Ecuador and a few other countries. It took him more than a year, but he made it up to the border in Tijuana, thinking that he was there to request asylum and that he would probably be with his friend in Los Angeles ready to receive him the next day. But because of a series of changes to policy at the federal level, that's not what happened. He showed up in May. He was basically told he couldn't go all the way up to the border. He needed to request to wait his turn. And what that meant was being given a number on the Mexican side of the border and told to wait a few months. He did. I actually met him in August. I was there with some pastors, and we actually met him randomly, and Jose took his case because it was a strong asylum case. And then finally, by the end of August, his number was called, which meant he formally applied for asylum. But there's this Remain in Mexico or Migrant Protection Protocols policy in place that meant he was turned back to Mexico after his initial claim. And now Jose has his next case next week, and the new challenge, as Juvenal waits in Mexico for his court date, when he finally gets to his court date, because he applied after July 15th, a new policy went into place, and he is ineligible for asylum unless he can prove he first applied for and was denied asylum in Mexico or another country he passed through. So he actually has what my legal colleagues think is a great case. I mean, that usually means you have had a very terrible experience. He has genuinely fled persecution, in this case for political reasons. But you can't just, Mexico doesn't have the capacity to process asylum claims. So it's not as a matter of he's unwilling to request asylum in Mexico. This is not possible. And so we're trying to figure out how to best advise him legally. And there's a few other options under the law, the Convention Against Torture, a few other possibilities. But that's a bunch of changes that have happened with one personal story, and it's the reason that I'm here instead of Jose, because he's prepping for his case in a few days.
Right. And actually, I met Jose just before I came here, and I talked to the Venezuelan asylum seeker, and his story is very sad because he tried to do everything right. He tried to get in the right way. And I asked him, a lot of people have been just crossing between ports of entry because they didn't want to wait. Why didn't you? And then he said, well, I'm a very moral person. I just want to do things the right and orderly way. But that has ironically hurt him.
It has, because had he crossed the border unlawfully in May when he first arrived, which would be unlawful, but it would still be lawful to request asylum under the law, he wouldn't be subject to this change in policy that went into effect July 15th.
Right, so.
Same question.
Yeah, same question for all of you guys.
Yeah, as Matthew mentioned, the numbers hitting the border. I'm in El Paso, Texas, right in the middle, sort of going east-west along the U.S.-Mexico border. The numbers are nowhere near an all-time high, but the numbers of families with children have been very high and increased over a number of years until MPP, otherwise known as Remain in Mexico, went into effect a few months ago. And so on the crisis side, I think is a lot of it, I think, for us as Christians is almost a crisis of our soul for ourselves in the way we're talking about our brothers and sisters who are coming to the border. There's absolute human suffering coming to the border, but I think the way a lot of us are talking about other human beings and many brothers and sisters in Christ is a bit of a crisis for me in terms of how the church has responded in many instances. We were up to, in El Paso, we were up to the point where maybe up to 1,000 people a day were being released into El Paso before MPP went into effect. And the churches had risen to the occasion. Locally, up to a group of about 30 churches were involved in El Paso. And now because of MPP, now everybody approaching the border is being forced to sort of remain in Mexico to pursue their case. So Ciudad Juarez on the other side of the border, our sister city, which is only about a mile from my house, part of the same community really, but in a different country, that has just been swelling with asylum seekers. And so many, many people have opened up their doors, including many churches. And I think part of our team, a couple of our team members are over in Juarez every week, often daily, working with some of the shelters there and trying to see how we can support the shelters. And the situations are very dire. In some instances, a lot of the asylum seekers are not in a safe position in Ciudad Juarez. It's not, generally speaking, it's not that safe, but they're sort of the most vulnerable, being migrants and not having any protections or fewer protections there. And so even one of the shelters that was mentioned in an earlier session, a church shelter where there was a number of Africans, there was 40 Africans that were seeking asylum that were there. One of them passed away a number of weeks ago, a lady we knew, and that was sort of through what seemed to be medical neglect. She'd been taken into the hospital and said, we're doing tests, and she went into a coma and was just sort of let go, and she passed away. It seemed like it was probably tuberculosis, and it wasn't treated, and maybe it spread to others, and just there's a lot of desperation and neglect. There's also a lot of hope. And in terms of like faith, it's been amazing for me to encounter so many of the asylum seekers that put my faith to shame and end up praying for me. And I come away with hope because of their situation.
Well, when I come to Tijuana, we moved, my family and I, from North Carolina. And I did not want to go there because that's the place that I crossed illegal in 1986. And the immigration was hard on me. They returned me about 8 times. For 2 weeks, I stayed in Tijuana and feel hungry and all that. But then when I come to Tijuana, I see a lot of migrants, like myself, in 1986. And I don't want to, my title is church planting, and I said, well, I want to start a church, but these migrants, they're going to the United States, they're not going to stay, so I'm not going to start a church with the migrant. And I did not want to get involved until 2016, when it was a huge caravan of people from Haiti come to Tijuana, and they were sleeping in the streets. I called the churches, pastors, and I say, these people are sleeping in the street with just a blanket. And I said, can we do something? Can we open our churches? And they said yes. So we opened 6 churches. And we took in about 600 people from Haiti. And I did not know what I was getting into. Because the next day, I said, can we just give them coffee and sweet bread? Yeah, sure. But then the government said, can you keep it over there? And then we start working with the government, with the Mexican government. And the long story short, right now, there's about 3,000 people from Haiti in Tijuana that they're not able to cross. and we started a church. So every Sunday morning, there's close to 200 people meeting at First Baptist downtown Tijuana. Pastor Juan Manuel Serrano is with me. He's the pastor there. And he told me, he said, do you ever thought that you're going to start a church from another country here in Tijuana? I say no. But now talking about Christianity, what can we do when all these people come last year from Central America, thousands of them? We start feeding with what we got. You know, when I arrived to Tijuana, they have a sound saying like, beans and rice plus Jesus Christ. And that stick in my mind, and I say, we should feed them and preach Jesus to them. And many of them get saved, many of them get baptized, many of them, they already stay in Tijuana. They say, you know, we want to stay here. We want to go to church here. So right now, I see a big church planting movement. And many of these people, they will go back, like myself, to their own country with Jesus Christ and preach Jesus in their own country. So, to me, it is a blessing what the Lord is doing. Because when you talk about people from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, all this country, they all speak Spanish. We did not need a translator. And I told people from Tijuana, the pastors, and El Paso, and Laredo, and Piedras Negras, because when we did this, it was like the Mexican government call us and say, hey, can you help us? Can your church help us in Juarez? There's about 40 churches in Juarez already open as a shelter, because there's 1,000 people in Juarez. And there's also in Piedras Negras, a church open over there. And they have all these migrants coming in. So the government is trusting the evangelicals already, because the president already put a guy named Arturo Farella to take over the migrant situation. So I went to Chiapas, and what I see in Tijuana, Chiapas is worse, in Tapachula. There's close to 10,000 people there. About 4,000 from Cameroon, and about another 4,000 from Haiti. And the Mexican government is not going to give them the paper to travel to the line, to the border line with the United States. And they're hungry, and they're getting sick. And I'm saying to the Lord, what can I do? Because I don't have all the resources. But I praise the Lord, because all the churches, not all, but a lot of churches in the United States, they're supporting us so we can feed them and we can do something for them. So it's been a blessing to see what the Lord is doing at the border with many people.
Yeah, so obviously part of the crisis, one of the people who have been most affected are children, very unfortunately. Could you talk a little bit about the unaccompanied children who have been crossing the borders and what Bethany have been doing to care for them?
Thank you for that. And I can't say enough about everything that was shared. I definitely believe that this is not a new issue. We all know that it has been going on for years. And Bethany has been serving this population since 1984. So this is not a new problem or crisis, as individuals like to say. But you know what? To me, God has this tendency to bring things to the forefront for a reason. And it's been brought to a reason, to the forefront for a reason to have all of these individuals in this room to serve this population right now, right? So to me, that's exactly what we need, to be able to have individuals that have far-reaching hands to be able to make a difference. And what we serve is, we serve the population in every aspect. We try to help with resettlement. We work with URM, which is the unaccompanied refugee minors. We work with unaccompanied children. We work with transitional foster care, where the children are coming over unaccompanied. And we put them in the less restrictive environment, which is the best case scenario that a child can be put in, except for to be in their home with their family. But we put them in a home with a family. so that they could be nurtured, they could be cared for, while we try to locate a family member so that we can reunify them together. But then we actually take it a step further where we provide post-release services as well, where we actually go with them in the community and actually connect them with churches to support them when we're trying to help them become successful in the community. The panel earlier the pastor talked about being a success in the community. So we actually believe that not only reunifying our children with our families, but allowing those families to feel like they are part of the community, feel like they are successful, and they're not just to be afraid of the knock on the door or to be afraid of what's coming next. So we try to walk this walk with our families and our children every step of the way. So we provide shelters, we provide our group homes, we provide all of the above to whatever the needs are for this population so that we can continue to evolve as this situation evolves, because it's not a problem, it's a situation. And it's only a problem when individuals cannot put resolution to something, and that is the real problem.
And obviously, these children are going all across the nation.
Bethany serves all across the nation, and so we open up transitional foster care programs wherever we can. And again, most places want to open up shelters in the sense of group homes. Now, if anyone believes that a 0 to 15-year-old should be in a group home better than being in a foster home where they can pop popcorn and watch movies, where they can go to the playground, where they can go to the pool during the summer, or they can actually have sleepovers, then you should raise your hand right now, because that's actually not what's best for a child. And what we are trying to do is to assist our children, because that's what we're dealing with, our children. We're assisting our children to be children. And we also have to remember that we're dealing with trauma, because every single one of these children that are coming across the border right now have trauma. If you can't see it, doesn't mean that it's not there. They come with trauma, and just because you can't touch it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean that it doesn't weigh on them. And so our job, our sole responsibility, is to care for the whole child and the whole family from that perspective.
And you mentioned that you connect them with churches in the area. How have local churches been responding to this?
That's the best part about what we do, is that we can't do it alone. The families that we work with, they connect with churches. We actually seek out churches to be that community around our foster families so that our foster families don't feel vulnerable when they are welcoming children into their homes, because that's scary as well. When we had that whole, the zero tolerance and the separation, the news, not the wonderful news that we have right now, but they were just intolerable when they were trying to find where our kids were. And our parents were fearful to go to the grocery store with their children. But the churches surround them, and they love on them, and they treat the children as if they're just another child, because guess what? They are. And that's exactly why we partner with our churches. We allow our churches to be exactly what we want them to be, which is a support network and a resource, because what we want is our families to connect with natural resources so they don't need individuals like us as much anymore. We want the natural resources to be that bridge for our families. And so we can't do it without the churches. So we see them as our bridgeway.
And Juvenal, this question is directed to you. One of the most amazing things I've seen while going down across the border is seeing Mexican churches step up to the plate. Can you talk a little bit about some of the needs that local churches in Mexico have in serving the migrants, especially in Chiapas? Like, I know that you are going down to Chiapas sometime in December.
Yes.
Okay, could you mention a little bit about some of the needs and the resources they might lack?
Well, right now, some of the churches, they were not really shelters operating. When we started, the government came 2 weeks after and say, hey, we want to help the church to be, so they can have showers and all that. A lot of churches, they just have the big buildings and the classrooms. And right now, they distribute, they're using the classroom. Some of them, they're using the classroom. So that means they build in more rooms. And that's a need. But the biggest need right now is in Chiapas. Tapachula, Chiapas is right the city where they crossed from Guatemala to Mexico. And the churches there also, you know, when all this started, we blame the government. We blame the government in Mexico, and we blame the government in the United States. But a few months ago, I asked the pastor, I said, you know what? God said to make disciples in all the world, to go to the nations. And for some reason, I don't know why, but speaking about money, we don't have money to go to Honduras. So guess what? He sent the Honduras right to us. So in Chiapas, right now, there's churches already working with the Mexican government, and they are starting the kitchen to feed the migrants. They know they're going to be there for a while. And some of the people from Africa, they want to stay in Mexico. They want to stay. They want a visa and work in Mexico. So I see a lot of this need. But now Javier Morales is the immigration chief in Tapachula, Chiapas. He called me about a month ago, and he said, you know what? Our biggest needs right now is doctors. We need doctors. We need medical people to help us, so they can come and see. They have a lot of children there. There's a lot of children from Honduras and from Haiti, from Africa, and he said, can you bring a team? And I called a couple of people. I said, can we go in December? And so far I only got one. So I said, well, can we go in January? Because I really think that when the government, the immigration call you and say, hey, we need it, there's something there. They know they don't have it. But now, since the church is stepping in, the community is coming together in Tapachula and then in Tijuana. And our biggest need is hands. People can come and help us. People can come and help us because there's cooking going on and all that for this. We have about 40 shelters in Tijuana, and everyone needs somebody they can come and feed them.
Yeah, and Sami, you mentioned that at one point there were about 1,000 people crossing the border into El Paso and then being released. But now with MPP in place, MPP is Migrant Protection Protocols, which is also known as Remain in Mexico policy. Now with that in place, what changes have you seen? Now that these people are not being released into the U.S., but being sent back to Mexico, and how are churches in the border still helping in any way?
Yes. So like I mentioned, there was about 30 churches on the U.S. side that were hosting asylum seekers for a day or two as they were released from ICE if they passed their credible fear test to move on to other parts of the country to pursue their asylum process. After MPP, then the numbers just started getting pushed back and started swelling in Ciudad Juarez. And the numbering system on that has gone up to about 20,000 that are in Juarez, and nobody really knows how many are there. And a more recent challenge, real hard issue, is that there's over 3,000 now asylum seekers from other parts of Mexico that are sleeping on the ground on the other side of each bridge, and they're refusing to go to shelters because they're scared they're going to lose their spot in line. And most of those are families with kids, and they're staying in tents or just laying out on the ground. whereas a lot of the Central Americans now are either have banded together and are in apartments, or they're in shelters, or there's many that have disappeared. It's really not a good situation. There's a lot of abductions that happen. So the churches locally in Juarez have opened their doors, and as was mentioned, there's dozens now. There's about 15 officially that are approved through one of the state government agencies in Chihuahua, the state of Chihuahua in Mexico. But then there's more unofficial ones. And so those churches have opened their doors. Some of them have denominational partners that have come helped. Some of the churches from the U.S. side have been going across. The organization that I lead, Abara, has been helping groups from around the country understand what's happening better on the border, and also support some of the shelters on either side right now, on the Juarez side. So anything from right now working on, just got going on a water storage and filtration system for one of the shelters, because there's no drinking water for 240 people, mostly kids. A big issue is just utility bills with electricity. Many of these churches are very small churches without much money. They're not doing this out of their abundance. They're doing this because there's people sleeping on the street, and they're like, how can we not do this? This is what Jesus would do. So they've opened their doors. And so helping with utility bills, or better yet, even like working with some NGOs to get solar panels to help with electricity bills. Some of the more exciting things are job training and opportunities. So like there's a few dozen women right now that we're helping support through funds that have come in from others to get training in sewing. And it's a certification that could work here in the US, or if they're deported back to Central America, they can use it there, but then it can also help generate income while they're on the ground. Bunk beds are a huge need. So right now we've hired a couple of asylum seekers in Mexico to be making bunk beds for the shelters. Back to just really quickly the crisis issue. In meeting with one of the heads of a state agency, COESPO, that sort of navigates and helps arrange the shelters in Ciudad Juarez, he was like, this isn't a crisis, this is an amazing opportunity for our city. He was like, our city needs all of these people, and we want to invest in them, and he was excited about investing in them. And he's seeing the tragedy, he's seeing a lot of what's going on. He was like, we need this, we need immigrants to survive, and if America doesn't want them, we'll keep them, because we would love to have them investing in our community. So that's another way of looking at it.
Yeah, so in all the time I've been reporting at the border, I've seen immense suffering, but I've also seen great opportunities, and I was really moved by the acts of compassion in display. And so I write on a lot of topics, but this is the one topic that I have gotten so many reader emails. I've never gotten this many reader emails. So obviously the border issue is a very controversial topic, and it's of interest to a lot of people. I've gotten 60% are negative, some of them are positive, but there was one email that I got from a lady that really, I felt, and like captured the frustration of a Christian American. And this is what she said. She said, as a Christian, I want to help the migrants, but as a citizen of this country, I wish there could be some parameters. I think my head will explode. What is the answer? So this is her email to me, and I'm going to direct it back to you guys. I think what she's trying to say is that what is our duty as Americans and Christians in regards to this issue?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I think that's the tension in some ways in the larger debates around immigration, but especially at what's happening at the border. Is there a lot of Christians feel this tension between, can we be a nation of compassion with a history of immigration, but also a nation of laws? And I think the good news is we can. Those ideas are not they're not necessarily at odds with another. What we need is an orderly, safe system. That doesn't mean everyone who shows up is allowed to come in, but it does, especially at a time when the United States actually benefits from so many of these people's contributions economically and in other ways. I think we need to have a functional asylum system. So that doesn't deter people from seeking asylum when they have a credible fear of persecution, which is part of our law, but is efficient enough that if you have a credible fear of persecution, Ideally, you'd get access to legal counsel, and that's one of the things we're trying to provide at World Relief where we can. You'd have the opportunity to prove your case and be allowed to stay lawfully and integrate into the United States. And if you're not going to qualify, you wouldn't have this, in many cases, years-long process where our asylum system is so backlogged that you're stuck in limbo for so long. And at the same time, I think we should have more visas for those coming who aren't fleeing from violence. But if you're fleeing a coffee crop that has failed in Guatemala, that's not going to qualify you for asylum. But the reality is we have jobs in the United States right now. We have like a 3.7% unemployment rate, and there would be many employers in the United States eager to hire those people if there was functional legal channels. And that's what we've always said, I know for us at World Relief, is we think we should have secure borders. This is not really a question, actually, of people sneaking into the country. The vast majority of these people are looking for the Border Patrol, even the ones crossing unlawfully. They're looking for the Border Patrol to request asylum. Now, some of them don't have very good background on who qualifies for asylum, and some, frankly, don't have great cases. Others of them do or did until we started changing some of the rules. But it seems like the new policy changes are designed to just deter people from availing themselves to the protections that are offered under U.S. law for those who have a credible fear of persecution.
I'd like to add to that. I think that for a lot of individuals, they struggle with that problem, and I think in that crisis. And I think that truly one of the things that I share all the time is that I am not a politician, and I don't want to be. And here's the bottom line that I look at, which is God calls us to take care of the least of them. And one of the things that we should always weigh is how we are caring for the least of them. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree or disagree with the policies and the policy makers, but the care of children and the care of families and treating individuals as you would want to be treated as human beings, that is something that should be a crisis of your conscience. And that is something that I would tell that woman, if she called me, that she should make a decision on. That is a simple decision to make. So if you want to help, those are the things that you should make decisions on. We can't always make decisions about, the layperson can't always make decisions about what's going on the Hill, but you can impact that. But the things that you can do, you can help the least of them, and you can help those who don't have a voice and stand in the gap for those who can't stand for themselves.
Well, one of the things that I stopped is blaming politicians. Because it's not about my opinion or my feelings. This is about the Bible. And God called me to represent Him. And I need to encourage people to do that. Because at the end, when I die or when everybody dies, it doesn't matter if you become a U.S. citizen. What is going to matter is if you become a citizen of heaven. And I told people, I said, you're desperate to get to the United States, but I wish you change your mind and be desperate to get to heaven. And many of them, they did. Because United States is not heaven. It's just part of the world. Mm-hmm. So I will say to many of the migrants, I know what you're feeling. I know what you wanted. But I also know that you need Jesus.
I think the root of that question is, like, where do we draw lines of responsibility in some ways? Is it around our national boundary, or where is it? Who's responsible for what's going on? And I think if we pull back a little bit, we're so interconnected to what's happening. This is just an isolated issue on the border or just related to our immigration policies. There are reasons people are fleeing where they're fleeing or leaving where they're leaving. And we're very connected as a nation in most cases. In Central America, for sure. We've intervened in so many ways, and we continue to be heavily involved in Central America. And so we're already connected. It's not sort of like, get your act together, we don't have anything to do with it. We're certainly not responsible for all of the challenges, but we have we've played a part in some of those. And also, I mean, with our drug consumption in the U.S., that's fueling so much of what's happening. And so there's one a shelter director, a long-term shelter director in El Paso, who basically, he says, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is his opinion. He's like, as long as we as Americans keep consuming drugs that are coming through Central America, which much of it is, then we need to accept every single person that comes to our border, because that's sort of, there's like a direct line between that. And if we stopped consuming our drugs here as a nation, then maybe things would, stabilize a bit in Central America, and there wouldn't be so many people fleeing. So my main point is we're intricately connected in a lot of ways, and just changing our immigration policy isn't going to change a lot of what's happening or a lot of the needs. It's just a response to larger issues.
Okay. And with that, I would just like to open up to questions, if you guys have any.
We're going to keep this real brief because
Yeah.
we're a little bit behind, but no, you have a question, you've started, we'd like to honor it.
No, I was.
Let's thank our panel.
Thank you.
We're all very curious as to what the question was now, so you are going to have to raise it at some point in the night. We are going to break for dinner. The instructions are very simple. It's just out the double doors here. If you have special dietary needs, please let the servers know so that they can be aware of that. There is no assigned seating, but we do have several subject matter experts that if you're interested in the topic that they are expert in, you should look for them. And I'd like them to stand for a moment. We've got Zach Smara from the Wesleyan Church on Immigration Legal Services. Where is Zach? Okay, so if you're interested in ILS, Immigration Legal Services, that's your man. Follow him out. Refugee Resettlement is Nate Bolt here from Bethany Christian Services. Nate. And then thirdly, Dreamers and Those with DACA, Liz. So if you have an interest in those topics, please find those individuals. Otherwise, just please find a place to sit and have some great connection time together. Thank you for your endurance and your patience. The night is getting long. We'll have dinner together. We're back here at 8 o'clock. We'll wrap up with a couple of other sessions. Let's pray together for a moment. Father, it strikes me that what we're grappling with together here in a very significant way is that thing which always seems to matter most to you. And that's the posture of our heart. Are our arms folded, and are we looking for the way to excuse ourselves from caring and acting? Are we perhaps looking for the way to do the bare minimum and still ease our conscience? Or are our hearts and our hands open saying, oh God, what would you have me do? And I'm convicted each time I ask that question of myself, because I know that there's something deeper you want to draw me into. So, Father, for each of us, we pray that you would help us to present our hearts to you, that you might have your way in our hearts. And if we as your people in this room and we as your people in this country will do that, this will all change. So we offer ourselves as a living and a holy sacrifice. And we pray that you would help us daily to do that in deeper ways. Thank you now for the food that you have provided. We've talked about many who do not have that security. We thank you for the grace that you've afforded to us. Help us to live in such a way that is an adequate response to that grace in Jesus' name. Amen.